Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our 2:30 Friday afternoon reading. I know it's summer, but I know it's good to keep reading throughout the summer, even though school's out. Anyway, just a little bit of a refresher. We've been reading this book called Buried in Ice, The Mystery of a Lost Arctic Expedition. And just a quick refresher for those of you who have been watching and those of you who are just joining us. So this is a story about the expedition, the Franklin expedition back in the mid, 1845, 1846. They were taking a ship. They were trying to go through the Northwest Passage, which is way up in the Arctic, and the ship got locked in ice. And there are two ships' names, the Terror and the Erebus, and our two main characters are Luke and John. And if you recall last week, something happened with John. He got sick. So now he is in the sick bay. Oh, it's hard to read that. It's backwards. But anyway, chapter 3 is called Sick Bay. And the time, the place, the Atlantic Ocean, place or time, June 16th, 1845. All right. So let's get started. Luke made his way through the forward mess. Out of habit, he held onto the edge of a table as he walked, even though the sea was calm today. It was a welcome change. For the past week, the wind had been high, the ocean a never-ending succession of long and lofty rollers. Even the seasoned sailors had been seasick. So Luke hadn't felt so bad about the many times he had hung over the rail in the past few days, vomiting until he was almost too weak to stand up. Ugh. The older sailors had reassured him that the seasickness would pass, and they had been right. He felt fine now. He only wished the same thing were true for John Torrington. Luke opened a tin of meat, like a can, and one of potatoes, and spooned some of each into a bowl. His mouth watered just looking at it, but the food was for John, not him. John hadn't been feeling well for almost a week now. Two other sailors were also sick, but the ship's surgeons could not understand what was ailing them. The surgeons had ordered the sick men special rations of tinned food to try to build up their strength, but so far nothing seemed to be helping. So remember, the tinned food, that's just canned, like canned beans, canned potatoes. They just called it tinned food back then. Luke carried the plate into sick bay. The other sick crew members were sleeping, but John lay in one of the beds, staring at the ceiling. When he saw Luke, he smiled and raised himself up awkwardly on one elbow. "Look what I brought," Luke said cheerfully. "The doctor has ordered tinned food for you, while us poor peasants gnaw on salt fish and hard biscuits day after day. You're eating as well as Sir John himself. The rest of us probably won't even get a taste of the tinned goods until we're in the middle of the Arctic and the regular supplies have run out." John's smile was wide. "Give it here. I might as well enjoy it. I'll be joining you fellows in those wormy seamen's rations soon enough, you know. I'll be up and about tomorrow." He struggled into a sitting position, and Luke handed him the dish. John began to shovel spoonfuls into his mouth, but Luke soon noticed that he was pushing the food around more than he was eating it. "No good?" he asked anxiously. John looked at him, annoyed. "Of course it's good," he said. He squinted at the dish. "I'm just not that fond of potatoes, that's all." The two stopped talking at the sound of deep voices outside the door. To their surprise, both Commander Fitzjames and Captain Crozier walked in, accompanied by the ship's surgeons. John sat up a little straighter and brushed the hair back off his face. This was a rare occasion. Commander Fitzjames must have rowed across from the Erebus. And I'll show you a couple pictures. So here's the top of a can or a tin from one of the canned goods that they were carrying. This is what that looks like. And then here is a painting of the captains. There's Luke and there's John Torrington sick in bed. "These men have been ill for a few days, Captain, but I expect the situation to change soon," Surgeon Petty explained. "It's too far early in the voyage for them to be suffering from scurvy, but I've ordered extra rations of tinned vegetables for them to eat just in case. And if you remember, scurvy was a disease a lot of sailors suffered from lack of vitamin C. So they needed vegetables. Remember, they had that barrel of lemon juice I had mentioned last week, and that had a lot of vitamin C. So that was important that they have vitamin C. Commander Fitzjames frowned. "It is very odd," he said. "We have 4 men in sickbay as well. Perhaps just an extended bout of seasickness?" Luke could see John's eyes widen with outrage, but the doctor shook his head. "The stomach pain is unusual. Besides, these men are all experienced sailors, and I doubt that," Captain Crozier broke in. "Well, feed them back to health, Mr. Petty." He looked at John steadily. "We'll be in Arctic waters soon, and it would help to have our chief stoker back in the engine room." Before John could say anything, the group of officers had turned and left the room. As soon as their footsteps grew faint, John's body sagged slightly, but he continued to eat. When he was finished, he handed his dish to Luke. "If eating is the cure, then I'll eat. Get me some more." As Luke and John climbed the steps to the main deck, the screeching of gulls filled the air over their heads. The ships were anchored in a protected channel at Disco Island off the west coast of Greenland. It had been almost 8 weeks since they left England. Slowly, the 2 sailors walked over to the rail. In the gray light of the overcast sky, John looked paler than usual, but his eyes gleamed as he took in the rugged, desolate landscape around them. On the island, men were collecting duck eggs, while others were preparing to slaughter the last of the live oxen for fresh meat. Nearby, the supply ships that had sailed with them, the Barretto Jr., was lashed alongside the Erebus, and several crewmen were busy transferring her stores onto the ship. Soon the supply vessel would return to England, leaving the 2 little ships to go alone. The expedition had been in the Davis Strait for nearly 2 weeks, and on the days when John wasn't feeling well, Luke would go below to tell him what was happening above deck. Already they had seen a large group of bottlenose whales plunging and frolicking nearby. On one day, over 60 drifting icebergs had been spotted by the lookouts, their sides sculpted smooth, their tops crusty. Nearly 100 walruses had swarmed around the 2 ships, tumbling, diving, and splashing with their flippers and tails. John had been eager for every scrap of news that Luke brought him, and he quickly wrote it all down in his journal. "You were my eyes," he would tell Luke. "When we get back to England and I sell this account, I'll split the money with you. Maybe you could do some sketches to go along with it." Luke smiled. He was quite a good draftsman, much better at drawing than John was. He had taken to spending many evenings in the ship's library, drawing the birds and landscape as he had seen that day. On other nights, if he was feeling well enough, John would spend a few hours teaching him how to read and write. Yeah, that's right, John didn't know how to read or write. "The air," John said happily. "I could drink it, it smells so good." He took a deep breath, but instantly bent over in a fit of coughing that came from deep within his chest. Luke clutched his friend's shoulders. "Maybe we should go back down," he said, trying to keep the concern out of his voice. For the past few weeks, he had thought that John was getting better. John had even managed to work in the steam room for several days, but now Luke could see just how drawn and thin his friend was. Even after 3 solid weeks of tinned meat and soup and vegetables, John's small frame seemed to disappear inside the new winter clothing that had been distributed to the crew. John shook his head vigorously. "No," he rasped. There were tears in his eyes from the effort of holding back his cough. "I've been buried down in that stinking hold for weeks now. This is an important moment, and I'm not going to miss it." So let's see. Here is a drawing of the 2 ships stopped in Greenland. Right there. And then here is a iceberg and walruses that can be seen all year long off the coast of Greenland, and that's like a photograph. So the melting of the icebergs makes it into these weird shapes, and then you can see the walruses up here. Luke nodded. It was a big moment today. Today, Harry Goodsir, the assistant surgeon on the Erebus, was going to bring out his daguerreotype, a wonderful new invention that could make pictures that look as real as life. The young men watched now as Goodsir and 2 other men wrestled the equipment off the ship's boat onto the shore. They began to set up a small tent and the camera, a large wooden box mounted on a tripod. When the camera was finally in place, Mr. Goodsir pointed it toward the two ships. Luke watched as the tall young Scotsman busily fussed with various knobs and plates and covers and looked at his pocket watch. He frequently threw up his hands and disappeared into the tent. It seemed to take forever. And Luke could see some of the officers beginning to fidget impatiently. They were all clean-shaven and decked out in full-dress uniform, complete with epaulets and stick-up collars. Finally, the smiling doctor emerged from the tent with a picture of the two anchored ships. So it's like one of the earliest cameras. He showed it to the group of men, and there were shouts of disbelief and approval. Then Goodsir waved, and the officers began to gather for a group portrait. Below the railing, the Terror's boat was getting ready to push off. "If you two are coming to shore, make it quick," called up one of the sailors. "We're leaving now." "This is it," Luke said to John. "They're going to take the group portrait. Let's go." John nodded as they made their way over to the ship's ladder. "All of England will see this picture," he said with a smile. "We'll be famous. Soon we'll be looking out over the Pacific Ocean. Heroes, every one of us." Remember, they thought they could go from the Atlantic to the Pacific through the Arctic. Sadly, that's not what happened. "Well, let's hurry then, or we'll miss it." Suddenly, Luke was pulled to a stop. John was staring at him with a puzzled look on his face. "What about that last load of coal?" he said. "We must get it on board before the supply ship leaves today." John had stepped away from him and was now standing very erect. He pulled his pipe out of his pocket and lit it. Then he took a few puffs and gazed at Luke sternly. With long wisps of lank brown hair hanging over his eyes, he looked almost comical, but Luke didn't feel like laughing. "What are you talking about? The Barretto Jr. doesn't leave for several days. Besides, she's loading the Erebus now. We won't begin to take on fuel until tomorrow." "As chief stoker, I believe I give the orders," John said coldly, and there was an odd look in the eyes that made Luke's neck prickle. "The coal must be loaded now." Then, his body rigid with anger, John slowly crushed his clay pipe stem between his teeth, biting his lip in the process. A thin trickle of blood slowly dripped down his lip. The squawk of a gull shattered the air over their heads, startling them both. John's face suddenly crumpled and his eyes clouded over. He looked down and stared at his feet for a long time. Then he dropped the still burning pipe bowl onto the deck. "I don't feel very well," he murmured. "I think I'll go back to bed. It's just a picture after all. It doesn't matter." He turned and began to shuffle back to the hatchway. Luke followed quickly, his face full of worry. What was happening to his friend? What was going on? And here's a picture. This is actually a photograph of Harry Goodsir. So not a painting, but a photograph. And then here is a painting or drawing of all the officers getting ready for their photograph. All week long, Luke helped unload coal into the Terror from the Barretto Jr. The fuel for the steam engines and boilers took up much of the space below decks, and the ship was now very crowded. John had been well enough to supervise for a few days, but now he was back in sickbay. Nothing had been said about the episode on deck. With the supply loading finally finished and their departure from Greenland imminent, Luke was enjoying his last day on firm land. Sir John encouraged all the crew members to wander about and collect specimens, so Luke had been out all morning gathering plants and shells and rocks. He had found some curious mosses and a flower that looked like a pincushion, which he wanted to show John. His friend looked better today. He was sitting at a small table, writing furiously. "What are you doing?" asked Luke, peering over John's shoulder. "I'm writing to my father. The supply ship is leaving tomorrow, and this is our last chance to write. Everybody's sending letters home. Just think, the next letters we write will be mailed from a Russian seaport on the other side of the continent." John smiled proudly. "After that, we'll be going home to double pay, I wager." "Fine by me," said Luke. John looked at him hard. "Why don't I write a letter to your aunt and uncle for you? You can tell me what to say and I'll write it down. then maybe we can get back to our reading lessons." Luke smiled gratefully. Could this be the same man who had behaved so oddly just a few days ago? Then he noticed the spot where John had bitten his lip. The sore wasn't healing too well. It looked ugly and raw. "After all," John went on, "it's only fair. You've been bringing me my meals. It's the least I can do in return. We'll look after each other. What do you say?" He started to chuckle, but his laughter turned into a gasping fit of coughing. The door to sickbay opened, and Surgeon Petty walked in, accompanied by Captain Crozier. "Still coughing?" the doctor asked as he beckoned John over to the bed so he could examine him. "Not too much, sir." The doctor began to press John's stomach. "Any stomach pain?" he asked. "None at all, sir," John said stiffly, but Luke could see the beads of perspiration that had broken out on his forehead. "Well, Seaman," the doctor announced briskly, "I'm afraid it would be best to send you home. The Beretta Jr. is turning back in the morning." He nodded toward the men in the other beds. "You and 4 others will be sailing with her." "But, sir," John protested, sitting bolt upright. He turned to Captain Crozier. "You can't do that. I'm well, truly." Captain Crozier frowned. "Mr. Petty says you've shown almost no sign of improvement. How will you manage to get through an Arctic winter?" "The British Admiralty can't afford to support a man who can't perform his duties, you know." "But I've been working, sir," John said. "I've been in the engine room every day. Ask Smith here." Captain Crozier raised his eyebrows and turned to Luke. "Well?" Luke swallowed and looked at John. He could see the pleading in his friend's eyes. He knew how much this voyage meant to him. "Yes, sir, it's true," he said at last. "Mr. Torrington has worked every day. He's getting stronger by the hour." "I only come back to sickbay for the good meals, sir." John laughed and flashed the captain his broadest smile. "Captain, I don't think," Mr. Petty began, but Captain Crozier was chuckling. "Very well," he said. "You know what lies ahead. Besides, the local people have said that this summer is much milder and earlier than usual. If all goes to plan, Sir John thinks we may well get through the passage this season." Then he turned and left the room. The doctor slowly turned to follow. At the door, he hesitated for a moment. Then he beckoned to Luke, who joined him by the doorway. "By the way," the surgeon said in a low voice, "a few of the other sick men have been showing some odd symptoms. Not physical as much as..." He looked at Luke and his eyes narrowed. "You haven't noticed any signs of unusual behavior in your friend, have you?" Luke looked back into the room at John, and their eyes held for just an instant. "No, sir," Luke said to the doctor. "Nothing unusual, nothing at all." All right, that's it for the chapter today. But a couple more things to show you. So I have photographs here of Commander James Fitzjames and Captain Francis Crozier. And here's photographs of those two. And then we have a final, this is a drawing of the Erebus and Terror as they were last seen by whaling ships off the Greenland coast in 1845. And remember, like I said, these ships were not that big, and the crew were packed in pretty tightly. All right, next week, chapter 4, it's called Winter Camp, and it's about winter camp. So we will start with that next week, and you guys, everybody have a great weekend. Have a happy 4th. Be safe. And real quickly, I know a lot of you already know, if you missed this will be on my Sean Forstler Realtor wall on Facebook, and then I will post it to my YouTube channel, and it'll be under the playlist Children's Weekly Reading Corner. All right, everybody, have a great one. Take care.